cosmopolitan ideal that inspired many of the thinkers in the 18th century became more or less of an almost reality in the 19th century. Men, money, and material goods, as well as the products of intellectual discovery and inquiry, increasingly traveled freely from one corner of the globe to another, with few political impediments standing in the way. Knowledge about the arts and the sciences became internationalized for an expanding circle of the general public. Knowledge about the arts and the sciences became internationalized for an expanding circle of people of those interests around the world. Governments of the civilized world did form international associations and reach various governmental agreements with each other. But for the most part, and separate from various changing political and military alliances, their associations and agreements were designed, for the most part, to facilitate the functioning of private intercourse among their citizens and subjects. They included international river commissions, railway and transportation agreements, telegraph and postal unions, health rules and guidelines, procedures for uniform weights and measures, and respect for patents and copyrights. Governments occasionally still tried to influence the construction of these international standards and procedures to benefit some domestic interest and limit the commercial penetration of some foreign competitor. But to a great extent, the thinking behind them was to establish general rules of the game, to assist in the further globalization of private commercial and cultural exchange. Now, whether even these matters concerning standards and measures and procedures could have been left also to the voluntary private association agreement of the citizenry is, of course, a separate historical issue. Governments also attempted to agree upon rules for arbitration of disputes among themselves, on civilized rules for combat and land and sea, and for the humane treatment of non-combatants and neutrals if wars should break out. These were meant to establish restraints on the destructiveness of modern warfare and to limit the damage to human life and private property. If wars were still to be fought, then at least the negative consequences for civil society should be confined as much as possible. In this classical liberal epoch before 1914, international order was created that facilitated a globalization of trade, commerce, and investment that fostered a cosmopolitan climate in which national borders, to a great extent, though of course never completely, no longer inhibited the free movement of either men or ideas, and which wars were considered wild things that were to be tamed, confined, and prevented from excessively harming human life. The fundamental force behind all of this was the idea of individual liberty and the sanctity of private property as an inseparable extension of that freedom of the individual. Governments were endowed with legitimacy and authority to preserve and protect the individual and his property from violence and plunder. Their function was meant to be negative and defensive. International order and a high degree of international peace was maintainable because, to a greater or lesser degree, the governments of that civilized world of that time shared the belief that that war among their nations should be either adjudicated into non-existence or fought by these rules of the game. No special organization for international peace and security was needed, since the leading nations of the world all tended to share the same rules of the game. Now, I appreciate that I am making a very broad generalization about this era of the 19th century, and that numerous particulars concerning each of these countries could easily be used to argue against my sweeping conclusions. I'm very conscious that my dear friend Harry Teasley is sitting there, and as a Southerner, he would be thinking at this moment that Richard is ignoring the greatest violation of these classical liberal principles in North America, the aggression of the Union against the rightful right of secession of the Southern states. Correct. And I believe there's sitting here my also dear friend and valued scholarly colleague, Ralph Rako, one of the leading classical liberal historians, who would rightly remind me that, yes, maybe the civilized countries did this among themselves, more or less, but that is not how they treated their colonial subjects in Asia and Africa. And he would be absolutely correct. Yet I believe that when looking over an historical period, it is sometimes possible to see an idea or a belief that can be said to have captured the spirit of the times, and that can be seen to have influenced the course of events in various ways, however inconsistently and incompletely. And in this sense, the classical liberal idea helped to restrain governments and set free the individual, and it served as the underlying conception that determined the rules of the game that international relationships were required in an era of free men, private enterprise, and civil society. International peace and order in this sense were inseparable from the classical liberal ideas of private voluntary association, peaceful competition, and a globalized system of division of labor. In the last decades of the 19th century, another idea began to challenge and finally supersede this classical liberal ideal. That idea was political and economic collectivism. In the late 19th and into the 20th century, it took various forms: Marxian socialism, fascism, Nazism, welfare statism, social democracy, neo-mercantilism, protectionism, and imperialism. But regardless of its permutation, its conceptions of man, society, and government opposed those of classical liberalism. Individual liberty, civil society, and market relationships were made subordinate to political ends, and in the end, and extreme forms of political and economic collectivism were suppressed completely. Men and society were repoliticized. It was the new idea of collectivism that set the world on the course that led to the First World War. Leading up to the war were the drive for monopolized markets, domestic regulation of trade and commerce, militarization of international relationships, the ascendancy of great power politics to which individual interests were to be made subservient, individual obedience to the interests of the state, and welfare statism with its nationalization of income and redistribution of wealth. The First World War dramatically reinforced these tendencies in a way that permanently brought an end to that classical liberal era. It also ended the particular conditions that were conducive to international peace. In the collectivist era of the 20th century, everything became an affair of state because nothing was outside of political consideration. Trade and commerce were no longer matters of private individuals searching for mutual advantageous gains from trade. Instead, they became issues of national prosperity, national employment, national industrial development, and national standards of living. Ownership and control of resources and raw materials in various parts of the world became matters of national security, as they had been under the older mercantilism before classical liberalism had freed and privatized the economic and international affairs of life. Every aspect of life, every human relationship, every form of commerce, enterprise, and exchange were politicized once again. Once more, they were made affairs of state rather than matters of private agreement and competition for improvement in the human condition. What motivated the shift from classical liberalism to the collectivist era? Two forces came into play in the 20th century. First, the power of special interests, and second, the appeal of the social engineer. The principle of the equality of individual rights for all before the law was replaced with the ideal of group privileges and entitlements for some at the expense of others at home and abroad. And Adam Smith's conception of a system of natural liberty, under which every individual was free to peacefully follow his own interests, with the cumulative results of men's interactions generating a spontaneous order of human relationships, was replaced with the hubris of the planner, who considered himself wise and knowledgeable enough to reorder society according to his higher vision of the proper, fair, and just relationships that should prevail among men. The fetish of the social engineer did not pass away with Nazism in World War II or with the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. It is the essence of the welfare state and has been the implicit agenda behind America's military interventionism around the world, both during and since